Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the threats against state and local election officials and our democracy. In 2018, one of my 3 daughters picked up a package on our front porch and brought it into the kitchen. Because of a recent threat against me, the bomb squad was called to conduct an investigation in my home. 2 years later, in the aftermath of Election Day 2020, armed protesters gathered outside of the Maricopa County Election Center, demanding that we count all of the ballots. Ironically, that's exactly what we were doing. But the misinformation and disinformation that had built to fever pitch motivated some of these people to corner one of my staff members outside the door, forcing what was effectively a rescue by law enforcement officers and other staff members. This is not a story about some deteriorating third world democracy on the verge of authoritarianism. This is America today. And unless everyone does their part and the truth prevails, we will face a level of uncertainty in this nation never before seen. My name is Adrian. I'm a graduate summa cum laude of the Arizona State University and the Sturm College of Law. You heard my bio, so I'll cut it a little short, except to say to any members of the United States Marine Corps or alums thereof, Semper Fidelis. But I don't come here as any one of those sorts of titles. I come to you as a county election official. I come to you representing the concerns, the stresses, the worries of tens of thousands of local, county, and municipal officials, appointed and elected temporary and permanent employees, volunteers, poll workers, clerks, election judges, marshals. We have dozens of titles, but most importantly, we are all Americans. I greatly appreciate that you have invited our voices into this conversation, and we encourage you to continue to listen to the voices of the folks who are most directly responsible for making our democracy work in service of this republic. We need your help. We need your protection. There's one more group I have yet to mention who will also get greater protection under the proposed legislation, and they're the single most important group of people in our democracy: voters. And they deserve your protection from intimidation and harassment as well. My written testimony describes the following in much more detail than I can get into. Many of the security and integrity measures that we put in place in Maricopa County, which resulted in an honest, fair, and safe election in 2020. The subversive efforts of the former administration and anti-democratic factions, which further perpetuate the mythologies and the widespread voter fraud, and how that's leaving election administrators as potential victims to threats of violence, harassment, and possibly physical harm. The harassment and threats of violence against election workers in Maricopa County I and my team experienced during my term in office and beyond are also there. And we speak a little bit in my written testimony about the coordination that we entered into with federal, state, and local law enforcement agents and other safety agencies. But before I conclude, I must express my gratitude here on the record to those people that I'm asking you to protect. I won't name them because they know who they are, and sadly, mentioning their names could actually result in additional threats against them. Their professional staff at the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and Election Department did the nearly impossible in just 4 years. We added 500,000 more voters to our voter rolls. And between 2016 and 2020, we saw 600,000 more ballots cast in one county alone, even during a global pandemic. That is access. This is work the whole team should be very proud of, and there's no level of lies, false conspiracies, fraudsters, or fools who will take away from these amazing people the work that we all accomplished. The Maricopa team, like teams around the nation, should stand proud for the work they did in 2020. It was a successful election, and nobody will ever take that away from the tens of thousands of Americans who did that work. I strongly support legislative efforts to protect election officials in Arizona and across the country from harassment, intimidation, threats, and political interference so that they can safely perform their duties to serve voters and protect election integrity. I deeply appreciate this committee's willingness to call attention to the ongoing national threat against state and local election officials and our democracy. I thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, for your time, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you very much for that testimony.
Mr. Fontes, as you know, this committee sends out official government staff to observe the administration of federal elections under its authority under House rules and the Constitution. During the last election, Maricopa County unbelievably refused access to any congressional observers, both Republicans and Democrats, who were forced to peer through a lobby window in order to see any of the process. Isn't sunlight the best disinfectant? Why should observer access be limited?
Madam Chair, Mr. Davis, I don't know if I have to go directly through the chair in these hearings.
No, just the witness can answer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ranking Member, I'm not exactly sure where you're getting your facts from, but authorized observers who were authorized according to Arizona state law, and I know you're a proponent of states making the rules, had all of the access that was required and granted as appropriate in Maricopa County during the entire 2020 election cycle.
Well, we'll get you some evidence from our official election observers from the House as to the problems they had, and I certainly hope we can work better together in the future to make sure that doesn't happen to either side when we're out doing our constitutional duty. How much money did you budget to administer the 2020 elections?
Mr. Davis, we budgeted well over $23 million. The issue that we ended up having, of course, was the global pandemic that I don't think anybody finally realized the impact financially. So it ended up being a heck of a lot more than that we spent. Public outreach, safety equipment, PPE, finding and locating new places where we could have our vote centers so that folks could vote at appropriate social distances and so forth. So the number of dollars that we budgeted certainly didn't amount to what we ended up paying.
Does that number include the CARES Act money that Maricopa County got? And I believe that's $399 million.
Well, that would not have been included in the budget because the CARES Act was passed way after our budget was passed, sir.
Okay. Well, I see I'm out of time, so I will yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Raskin is participating remotely. Mr. Raskin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair, for calling this really important hearing. Mr. Fuentes, in your testimony, you talk about all of the security measures that Maricopa County had to undertake during the 2020 election, including bringing in a SWAT team where you were counting ballots in order to prevent for the possibility of violence or turmoil in the event that the armed protesters outside the building got in. Can you explain how the security situation and the threats you received affected your operations and the staff?
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. The threats really were certainly not anticipated, and they had a significant and severe impact on the staff. Some of the impact included folks having to deal with circumstances well beyond just what happened at the time. The anxiety, it was very difficult at some point after the election, once a lot of the threats and the protests outside of our building happened, to make sure that election workers would come back. Folks had to be escorted back and forth to their vehicles by armed guards of the Judicial Protective Services and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. And it's not a normal situation when fully armed and fully armored SWAT teams have to be present, because that's what security officials recommend. When folks are outside armed with AR-15 style and AK-47 style weapons, essentially threatening to storm the building. And that's a kind of a stressful situation that no civil servant, no election administrator should ever have to deal with. But they came through. And I have to say again, I'm incredibly grateful to the tens of thousands of people across the country, but particularly my team at the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and Elections Department. They came through with flying colors under the worst situation.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your service.
Last week, the former Republican Secretary of State, Ken Bennett, was barred from his own audit. As I understand it, he's working with the state Senate on that audit within the state of Arizona as they continue to engage in actions on the false premise of misconduct during the 2020 elections. The audit's being focused on Maricopa County, where you used to work. Can you please explain how misinformation and disinformation campaigns that balloon into these ridiculous audits affect our nation's election integrity efforts, and the dangers of partisan audits being conducted by individuals who don't have any experience?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Aguilar. I think the first piece of misinformation and disinformation is actually calling what's happening right now in Arizona an audit. It is nothing of the sort. It never has been, and it was not intended to be. And I don't know any auditor who has any sort of professional certification who will stand by what is happening with Maricopa County's 2020 election, its ballots, its equipment, its data and information, and audit. That notwithstanding, misinformation and disinformation has moved a lot of normally reasonable people in Arizona and across the country to question what is a normal exercise conducted by average citizens just like you and me and anybody else out there. For some reason, the misinformation and disinformation has raised so much mistrust in basic systems. Systems, by the way, which are run by, in many cases, the political parties themselves. As an example, the mandatory hand count audit that is mandated by state law in Arizona, the county party chairs of the political parties are the ones who select the folks who perform the audit. They are the ones who oversee that audit and who are essentially coached in process only by the elections department after the election. So that hand count audit that is mandated by state law is actually performed by partisans in order to maintain the integrity of what is happening in every county in Arizona, not just in Maricopa County. That's just one example of how misunderstandings arise. Another really important example is the allegations of Sharpiegate, for example. In 2018, we had a very different election system. We had different ballot styles. We had different ballot paper. The machines themselves that tabulated ballots operated on a completely different architecture. They were completely different than what we have in 2020. And that's why Sharpies were not recommended in 2018, but were recommended in 2020. And I can get into details if you'd like. But the reality is this. There are folks out there who want to subvert our democracy. There are folks out there who don't want every eligible U.S. citizen to vote. I don't count myself among them. There are folks out there who are afraid of the voice of America's voters. And in order to advance their political agenda, they think it's better to have less voters voting, to have a diminished American voice. And I think that's wrong. And that's why I'm partially here, particularly, though, to help election officials across the United States at the local, municipal, and state level stay safe. And that's one of the critical components that we've seen. The misinformation and disinformation leads to those threats of violence, leads to that problem, and I appreciate that.
I'd like to ask each of you to address what do you think Congress should do to aid in protecting you from continued threats and violence and enable you to do your work. Mr. Fontes?
Thank you for that question. The critical component here, I think, that Congress can do is recognize that there is a difference between what we do as election administrators and what a lot of other people do. And of course, all of the work of government is important in its own way. But election administration is the golden thread that holds the fabric of America together. And it is a bipartisan effort. And without the current legislation, we will continue to see the threats and intimidation and violence rise. And so to directly answer the question, you can help by passing the bill that's on the table.
So I'd like you to talk about how you see that connection with what you yourselves are facing. Mr. Fontes.
Thank you for that. If I could, this isn't just about me or Clerk Winfrey. This is about all election officials across the country. We are a unified band of bipartisan brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles. We learn from one another, we exchange best practices, and we certainly do share our experiences. And I think I'm joined by so many people across the country looking in horror at what happened here on January 6th, but also what could have been just after the election in November of 2020. We had armed almost rioters in Maricopa County. We had Alex Jones and the Q Shaman literally arm in arm shouting my name and shouting for other election officials in the parking lot. And their compatriots armed with some pretty heavy-duty firearms. And I know, because I was a range coach and marksmanship instructor in the Marine Corps, I know what kind of damage those weapons could do. And that was certainly no civil act of protest. That was not a grievance. The presence of those weapons in this environment was a threat. And that was very difficult. It was a step away from what happened here. And I hope and pray that everyone will pay attention to this, because the Republic depends on folks like us who work in a bipartisan way, who work, Republicans and Democrats, independents, libertarians, Greens, everybody works together to do this across the country. And this, it needs to end. The motivation behind these threats is the lie. That needs to end. Reasonable people have to come together in the United States of America to say enough is enough. And folks like us who just want to do our jobs, who just did our jobs, need to stand up and I think say the same thing. And I think Clerk Winfrey would agree with me on that.
I do.
Mr. Fontes, I wonder, you alluded to, the concern in the parking lot. Can you give us a picture, if your words, draw us a picture for what was around Maricopa County's counting site?
Thank you, Chair Lofgren. The front parking lot, if you will, of the warehouse is framed by 3rd Avenue and Lincoln in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. And the parking lot is sort of framed on the north and the west by what's almost a two-story building. On the west, it's a two-story building, but a rather large off-the-ground part of the warehouse on the north side. And in the parking lot itself, we made sure, in working with security officials, that the folks who wanted to come out and share their grievances, like the First Amendment says, petition their government for that redress, had space enough to be able to have their voices heard. Now, we didn't put up a security fence and a perimeter until after some incidences where folks had literally forced their way into the lobby. We tried to keep it as open as possible. We tried to be as transparent, as open as possible with the media and members of the public as well.
Can I follow up with a question? Because, I was in local government for a long time, 14 years. We ran the elections. We had the registrar of voters. We never had a situation where people came and demonstrated while the votes were being counted. You vote, you have elections. That never happened. Was demonstrations about counting the votes, is that being fueled, in your judgment, by the big lie?
Well, Chair Lofgren, we've never had a sitting president of the United States of America say, if I lose, it's because there was fraud. We've never had a group of politicians in the United States of America willing to carry on with that kind of sycophancy, with that kind of irresponsible deterioration of the confidence that the American people should hold in our most fundamental of institutions. We've never been here as a republic. And we can see now how fragile this democracy, this experiment in democracy really is. And it is disappointing, to say the very least, that we've gotten to the point where folks like my former staff and folks like Clerk Winfrey's current and future staff, election officials across the country who just want to do their jobs. They just want to be the folks who get that work done, because they know how important it is. We all know how important it is. Again, to parrot Clerk Winfrey, none of you would be here if it wasn't for local election officials. We've never been here because we've never had a significant group of elected officials in this country irresponsible enough to render asunder the confidence that we have in our election systems. It is a horrible new place that we find ourselves in, and we have to end it.
And in your judgment, does that really threaten the future viability of our democratic republic?
Madam Chair, we were just a few minutes away in this very building on January 6th from not carrying through with our constitutional duties, which was, up until this year, a normal, everyday, regular, boring process. We are in dangerous new territory, Madam Chair, in my view, and unfortunately we have to fight to get back to where we ought to be.